I'm Steve Franzik. I'm a retired professor of political science at the U.S. Naval Academy.
I'm Diana Owen. I'm a professor of political science at Georgetown University.
Good morning and congratulations to you. My name is Tom Tinder and I'm an attorney in Charleston, West Virginia.
Hi, I'm Ben Phillips, and in addition to We the People, I'm also on my school's Model UN and Speech and Debate teams.
I'm Drew Allen. I'm an Eagle Scout and I play varsity baseball at our high school.
And I'm Aubrey Bradshaw, and I sing in our school's choir and run on our cross-country team. And our coaches are Miss Lindblom and Miss Litzenberger.
Well, thank you very much for coming this morning. We'll be doing question number 2, which I will read. President Dwight D. Eisenhower said, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. Do you agree or disagree? Why? What disagreements did the founding fathers have about a standing army, and are they relevant today? And to what extent should there be an international U.S. military presence?" You may begin.
We agree with Eisenhower. The economic incentives of private defense corporations combined with significant congressional influence create a perpetually paranoid culture in which any threat is inflated to whatever degree is necessary to justify higher spending. The founders feared the raw power of a standing army was a threat to democracy, which to some extent is still relevant, but is considerably outweighed by budgetary and political concerns.
The iron triangle of defense corporations, the Department of Defense, and members of Congress is what constitutes the military-industrial complex. The continual demand for weaponry caused by the Cold War fueled the emergence of an arms sector of the private economy that had a significant incentive to keep weapons demand high.
Eisenhower's fear of misplaced power stems from Congress's susceptibility to making irresponsible decisions in regards to military action and spending. Defense corporations spent about $1 billion on lobbying since 2011 to raise defense spending caps originally implemented to reduce the national debt. In the executive branch, the Secretary of Defense holds the power to create government contracts with defense corporations, as well as great influence over public sentiment in America.
For example, The Atlantic reports that former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld demanded that his staff, quote, keep elevating the threat level of al-Qaeda after 9/11 to scare Americans into supporting the war on terror. Many recent secretaries of defense, including Jim Mattis, Mark Esper, and Lloyd Austin, have worked for defense corporations, presenting a clear threat of undue influence as those corporations have an incentive for the U.S. to pursue aggressive military efforts.
The founders also recognized the danger of undue military influence, but rooted their concerns in the prospect of a standing army. In Anti-Federalist 24 and 25, Brutus declares that a standing army would subvert the forms of government according to the pleasure of its leaders. Madison agreed, explaining that the executive and military would not long be safe companions to liberty.
Some founders, notably Hamilton in Federalist 25, refuted the fears of a standing army and stressed its importance to national defense. The Constitution addresses these sentiments by dividing the powers of war and military maintenance. Article 2, Section 2 makes the President Commander-in-Chief of the military, while Article 1, Section 8 grants Congress the power to declare war and to raise and support an army.
Today, Madison's fears of executive dominance over the army are the most relevant, with no formal declaration of war by Congress since World War II, despite U.S. involvement in 5 major wars and countless international conflicts. However, Brutus's concerns about the erosion of civil liberties by standing armies are not particularly relevant today, as Hamilton's view of a standing army as a necessity for the defense of any modern major nation has largely prevailed. The real debate today is the international question.
We do not require the expansive physical presence the U.S. currently maintains. With over 800 international bases, the U.S. has roughly 90% of the world's foreign bases. American University's David Vine estimates that the cost of bases in non-combat zones is $71 billion annually.
The U.S. should drastically reduce its base count, as military bases are largely inefficient and outdated due to advancements in travel reducing response time. According to the Rand Corporation, bases are also not strong enough to deter large-scale attacks. However, the U.S. should still operate essential bases, such as Guam and Diego Garcia, which are geographically capable of countering China.
Further, the U.S. should send more troops to NATO's Enhanced Forward Presence program to check Russia and reaffirm its commitments to allies. Finally, the U.S. should continue to support UN initiatives against terrorism.
Military is an indispensable insurance policy, but the extreme political clout that defense corporations wield turns foreign policy discussions into insurance ads. Danger must always be present, otherwise there's no demand for their products.
America must break this mindset, or we continue to overspend on our insurance, anticipating chaos in every corner of the world. Further, peace becomes impossible as the profits of these corporations necessitate conflict.
Thank you very much. As you might have guessed, we've got some follow-up questions. Should the government require all citizens to register for selective service? Why or why not?
I believe the government should require citizens to register for selective service because selective service is still an important aspect to our military, especially when we come into large-scale conflicts with other countries. The U.S. has a fairly large military in comparison to other countries, but when we're dealing with a large-scale conflict, such as with possibly China or Russia, then we do need the military to expand, which is why selective service is necessary.
I have to disagree with Drew on this point because I think that the selective service and the draft process are actually unconstitutional on the grounds that they constitute a violation of the 13th Amendment's abolition of involuntary servitude. The United States cannot force its citizens into serving for such a potentially dangerous organization. And if citizens don't come out to support the US military enough to further our international endeavors, that should be a signal to the American government that it should change its international priorities.
The U.S. military often gets involved in humanitarian initiatives. What is your perspective on this? Do you think that the U.S. military should be involved in other countries in humanitarian causes?
I think it should. And I think it should also be involved in what we say we do, promoting democracy. I think that all of that ties into the State Department and working with them to supplement their efforts with embassies and diplomats. And a great example of this would be in Kosovo. We see that we sent troops there in 1999 to help their citizens and help their country build back up and prevent a genocide, which we were successful in. We worked with NATO to provide that, and we stay there currently, but we've been pulling troops to help them build up their own force. So I think that's an example of a time where that was really successful, and I think we should do that more often.
I think that the U.S. military shouldn't be solely responsible for its peacekeeping operations. I think that it needs the backing of the UN to do that. And I think the U.S. has been recently pursuing UN backing with a lot of its military engagement, specifically in Afghanistan, when it most recently in 2019 made a peace agreement with the Taliban. And directly after that peace agreement, it went directly to the UN, drafting a resolution asking for UN support behind that peace agreement. I think U.S. needs similar support behind its peacekeeping operations so that it's not just a foreign nation involving itself in another nation's affairs.
You gave several examples of secretaries of defense who had worked for defense contractors. What can be done, or what should be done about that to make sure that there is not that sort of undue influence that could occur?
There should be a definitive limit on not only government positions that lobbyists or former lobbyists are allowed to hold, but also government officials should not be allowed to join private corporations after they leave office. For example, in the 1970s, the rate of members of Congress entering the private sector as a lobbyist after their term was complete was only 3%. Today, in 2017, that measure was at 42%. And half of all senators enter the private sector as lobbyists. There needs to be some sort of cutback on this.
Now, I'm talking about secretaries of defense. I'm not talking about members of Congress. I want to know specifically what can be done about those secretaries of defense working in coming from the private sector.
And I think that's exactly what we need to do is to have Congress pass a law which prevents those secretaries of defense from, or at least preventing the president from choosing those secretaries of defense. Similarly, we already have regulations on who and where can be drafted into the Secretary of Defense position. Like we already have a requirement having the Secretary of Defense be retired from the military for a certain amount of years so that he's a civilian. We need to have similar requirements in terms of those Secretaries of Defense coming from those corporations so that we don't have this undue influence.
Go
ahead.
I would say let's shift gears to the broader kind of aspects of Unit 6. Legislation to make election laws more strict has been proposed in many states. What do you think caused this, and what do you think we should do about it? Is it a good idea or a bad idea to make the laws more strict?
I would argue that it is a bad idea to make laws more strict, and it focuses on the wrong part of our election process that is flawed. There has been no official substantive evidence of widespread voter fraud. This is just a massive disenfranchisement campaign, especially in places like Georgia. Instead, we should be focusing election reform on getting money out of politics to reduce political inequality that stems from economic inequality. First and foremost, we should focus on election reforms that target decisions like 2010 Citizens United v. FEC, not disenfranchising more Americans.
I disagree. I think the laws should be stricter, and I think that we should be doing more investigations into things like voter fraud. And I think that there should be more precautions to keep these elections more balanced. And one example of this that can be seen that has to do with military is just the sheer fact that major big companies can be donating to campaigns. I think that's just another example of something that needs to be limited in order to keep these elections fair and keep them, I guess, as they should be. Something that should be reinstated would be the Tillman Act of 1907. I think that would be a great thing to keep these corporations from donating and keep elections more partisan.
I think at the end of the day, we have to address the arguments of the right, which are saying that there was election fraud in the election. Even though, despite evidence that there isn't, a big reason behind the January 6th riot was the fact that all of these Republicans were saying that there was voter fraud. But I think there are ways we can address this and make elections more secure without necessarily disenfranchising so many voters. Such as in Arizona, for instance, we have voter ID laws, but they're very expansive. So we have we have a photo ID law where you can provide a photo ID, but we also have additional ID laws where you can provide something as simple as a utility bill or an address or a registration, a native registration card for Native Americans on reservations. And so by providing these expansive ID laws where a large list of things are accepted for those IDs, we can have secure elections without necessarily disenfranchising a lot of voters.
Thank you.
So you mentioned the attack on the Capitol. I'd just like to ask, kind of linking the two questions, under what circumstances, if any, should the National Guard be deployed domestically?
Well, I think that in terms of domestically, the president already has a good amount of power in deploying the National Guard that stems from the 1807 Insurrection Act. And the National Guard has been deployed numerous times due to that act, such as Eisenhower's deployment of the National Guard to desegregate schools in Little Rock, and also the National Guard's deployment to numerous states during the BLM riots that were requested by certain state governors. So, and I don't think there have been very many abuses of power in that area, because state governors have jurisdiction over the National Guard and can ask for the National Guard to be deployed in their state, which gives the local governments a little more power over the National Guard. So I think that already we have a good amount of National Guard deployment in the United States and not very many abuses of power in that area.
I actually have to disagree with Drew. The National Guard can be a useful tool, but it's, I think, just incorrect to say that it can't be used for abuse of power, specifically potentially limiting some of the citizens' civil liberties. For example, standing armies really grew to the size they are today in the mid-1870s after the 1877 railroad strike. And afterwards, standing armies were largely used to break up strikes in America. They have a history of limiting some of the protections for citizens. So to insinuate that they can't be used in that sort of negative way for citizens' rights, I think is wrong. And they should still be held to a high standard of accountability to citizens and their state governments.
I definitely, go ahead.
No, you go, ma'am. Go ahead.
I was
Aubrey.
just going to say, I definitely agree with Ben that they should be held to a high standard, but I do think that they do a lot of good. And if you look at the border currently, especially with Arizona's National Guard being deployed to the border, I think that while in certain places they shouldn't have been, there's multiple places along our border that their deployment was good, and they help with medical operations, with setting up and analyzing reports from cameras. They set up different tents and living conditions and help handle those people. So I think while they should be held to a high standard, we can't deny that the size that we have and that the amount of people that we have, as long as they're kept in check, can be used to do so much good.
Quickly, you said that Congress has not declared war for decades. What should we do to change that? What needs to be done?
Well, one thing that we need to do in terms of checking this, because a result of or the reason why Congress hasn't declared war is because of executive action over the military. And a reason for that is a lack of enforcement for the 1973 War Powers Act. And I think we need to have more enforcement of that act. But we can't have that in terms of the courts because Congress is.
Please finish a sentence or two.
Okay, Congress has already taken the president to court numerous times, such as in cases like 1983 Crockett v. Reagan and 2016 Smith v. Obama. So the courts have refused to rule on that. So it comes down to Congress's responsibility, as labeled in Article 1, Section 2, to impeach the president. They need to use that authority to check the president and enforce the War Powers Act.
Thank you.
Well done. You've got a tough question to deal with, and you handled it well, and you handled our questions, which were kind of out of left field, not directly related to the basic question. Good use of court cases, good use of evidence. Remember that throughout history, major changes have been made by intelligent people with knowledge, and you have that knowledge now, so we kind of expect you to go on and act on it. Diana, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I was just unmuting. I'd like to agree with my colleague that I thought you did a wonderful job. I thought the way that you addressed the question, it was very sophisticated. You relied on the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, Supreme Court cases, laws. You knew your history. You talked a lot about executive actions, about different players within the government and how they kind of intersected with the question. I like the way that you brought in, key concepts like Iron Triangle. I like the historical dimension that you brought to this. I just thought you did a really very strong job with your opening statement, that I actually had a number of additional questions that I had jotted down. So, you got me thinking. You gave me just enough because you covered a lot of ground that you stimulated thinking on my part, that I wanted to know more. And clearly when I asked the follow-up questions, you knew your stuff. I thought that you were very sophisticated in the way that you answered questions. You brought in statistics, and in the follow-ups, you were just as thorough as you were in your prepared statements and your knowledge of, of the topic. And even when, kind of we threw in some questions that were a little far afield, you really just demonstrated tremendous command of the material. I just have to say that, I also liked the way I know you brought in the border issue. You're from Arizona. This is kind of also linking it to something that's more local. You had a good knowledge of federalism and how that worked. That came through in your answers. So overall, just a really fantastic job. Thank you.
Thank you.
I must tell you that when you're the first group today, so we didn't know what to expect with such a narrow sort of question and an issue here. We thought, this could be tough getting through a 10-minute question and answer. Well, we were wrong. You gave us a tremendous amount of interesting information in your and responded very well to the questions in your 4-minute presentation. And that led us then to have a number of questions that we wanted to ask you. And as Diana said, we weren't able to do that. I want to particularly highlight a couple of things. First and foremost, as a lawyer, we're trained to know both sides of an issue, at least the two sides of an issue or more sides. And sometimes what happens in these We the People competition is, we just have the position, the team position or whatever. You did a very good job of not only telling us what your position was, but also in telling us what the other side was. And as was said, respectfully disagreeing with your colleagues. Wish we had more of that respectful disagreement in our civic discussion today. And you did it, and you brought up all the points, gave us both sides, and it was just very well done. And particularly, I want to highlight again, when we gave you a question about voting and voting reform, bingo. I mean, you were experts as it related to that and gave us both sides of the issue. Very well done. I wrote down a number of things that you talked about that were very interesting, beneficial, and items that we wanted to have questions about. The only thing I would, and this is so minor, but we have a process where we know who's going to speak and so forth. It seemed, I would suggest that you might want to have that process on the question and answer period, so that you know that someone is always going to be the first person, because there were just a couple of momentary pauses, and I thought for a moment, we've asked them a question they don't know. Again, I was wrong, because after a 2 or 3 second pause, then you came back with a very nuanced and intelligent answer. Thank you so much. This was very beneficial. And I just must say one last thing to you. You have a wealth of knowledge. You already demonstrated your leadership capabilities and what you told us you do in your high school. Please don't let this We the People program and this We the People experience cause you to just end your interest and involvement in being good citizens come tomorrow. Please continue to use your leadership and your knowledge to be leaders in your school, in your community, and in the state of Arizona and throughout the nation in the decades to come. Thank you very much. Good luck to you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, we appreciate it.